apples-to-apples comparison in terms of the minimum level of navigational safety that's achieved. So what I'll do is, using this slide, I'll share some of the background considerations before going into the key recommendations that we developed from this study. So as mentioned earlier, we have noted that there is a gap in terms of the standardized digital testing framework for MARS. And one possible reason for this gap is there's this need for a risk-based approach where every vessel is assumed to be a novel development and hence needs to be qualified from first principles. This works well from maybe a vessel developer's point of view, but it creates a problem from a third-party perspective or from a regulatory perspective, where it's actually quite difficult to ascertain how a given MARS platform performs as compared to an existing vessel or other MARS systems. And in some ways, this is rather ironic because the whole concept of all these novel systems relies on the demonstration of equivalence to existing vessels and as well as other sort of comparable autonomous vessels. So for this project, what we did was to first do a scan of the various technical publications, academic literature, and we also interacted with some of the industry stakeholders to understand the pain points when it comes to demonstrating their the sort of fitness for purpose for their vessels. And then from there, we identify certain guiding principles that will allow us to eventually develop the guidelines document. So here are the guiding principles, and I'll just briefly describe what they mean and the implications. So the first one, in terms of digital modeling, it seems rather obvious that the underlying assumption for any digital testing is that the vessel should be at a stage where the dynamic response, so everything from the hull, hydrodynamic, steering, propulsion systems, should be defined to a stage where you can capture them as accurately as possible using mathematical models such as maneuvering models that we see in Chen Zuo's presentation earlier. So this means that for new vessels or new designs, the hull form, steering, and propulsion systems should be defined or well defined for example, just before the construction stage, or even when it's at a concept design stage. The specifications should be clear enough to allow for mathematical modeling. And this is important because we understand that such desktop simulations are often carried out using very simplified models that actually don't capture the actual platform dynamics of the MARS being tested. So the next one is simplicity. This seems rather obvious, but actually the implication of this is that because of the risk-based nature of MARS, there's this tendency for very subjective interpretation on how they should be certified or qualified. So by developing guidelines that are as simple as possible, it minimizes this risk of differing interpretations between different stakeholders. And also the other aspect of simplicity is by leveraging on existing practices or existing frameworks, the compliance complexity by stakeholders will be reduced. And this hopefully will allow for faster adoption of autonomous technologies. The third one is goal-based approach. So this seems, I guess this is quite pervasive and something that is required for autonomous vessels. And from a research point of view, I thought it's also useful to take this point to highlight that in this project, we actually link this goal-based or risk-based nature of autonomous ships to the hydrodynamics, very physics-based analysis in terms of the performance. And then lastly, there's this need for confidentiality from an industry developer standpoint. And this means that any testing guidelines need to respect the need for confidentiality in terms of the technologies implemented And hence, the test will take a point of view where we just look at what is the safety outcomes from the autonomous vessels. So based on those guiding principles, we, together with our collaborators from the Singapore Maritime Academy, we came out with a simple 3-stage approach as follows. So in the first stage, we verify just the pure hydrodynamic, the accuracy of the hydrodynamics model, and also take this chance to quantify any errors or discrepancy between this computational model and some benchmark data, be it from sea trials, model tests, or even CFD simulations. And then we take a progressive sort of next step where we test a very simple point A to point B navigation, where the autonomous algorithm that's being implemented will be used to steer this digital model from point A to point B. And what is implied in this is also that the autonomous algorithm needs to be able to generate some of the intermediate waypoints for the navigation. And at the same time, this is where we introduce different operating environmental loads that's reflective of the area of operations for the vessel. And then in the third stage, we take another step in terms of complexity, where the autonomous algorithm needs to steer the vessel or the digital model to avoid collisions under the different COREX scenarios. And in this stage, we use the CPAs that are obtained or generated from the simulations as a means to check the navigational safety of the mast. So now the question is, why do we use CPA? So as mentioned earlier, there's a need for us to demonstrate, or for the mast vessel to demonstrate that there's at least equivalent safety to existing vessels, and in the future, to compare different autonomous vessels. But how do we interpret safety given the subjectiveness of COREX, especially when we get terms like early and substantial actions, or the ordinary practice of seamen for a particular sea area? So by looking at AIS data and tapping into seafarer experience, we can actually determine what are the safe outcomes for particular maneuvers or collision avoidance maneuvers. And these outcomes will be in the form of CPA values. And these, given that the data is extracted from a particular area and from seafarers operating in a particular area, it will naturally capture what is deemed as the ordinary practice or the safe navigational culture of this area. So to do this, we carried out both a survey of different seafarers as shown here, as well as looked into some of the historical AIS data. And we looked at a range of vessels as shown here on the left. So from the data, we noticed that the CPA values are somewhat constant across the different scenarios. And also, there's also somewhat the data is somewhat comparable between AIS and seafarer data, except that for the seafarers, there's a certain level of safety precaution, so the values tend to be higher. And the other observation is that for the passing of navigation mark, there seems to be an apparent discrepancy. But when we looked into the data and realized that this is due to the differences in which the safe distance is being calculated from AIS data versus how a seafarer perceives it. So in terms of AIS data, it's usually calculated between the vessel or where the system is mounted on the vessel and the center of the navigation mark. Whereas as a seafarer, what they tend to perceive will be between the vessel and the edge of, for example, the shallow water region that they need to avoid. And that, in the area around Singapore, once you deduct for that, we find that actually the minimum CPA for the last category is also quite comparable. So now once we have the CPA, sort of the benchmark values to use, and then we revisit the 3-stage framework, where in the third stage, we look at the collision avoidance capabilities and then use that to extract a raw CPA. And this raw CPA will be used as a gauge of whether the autonomous vessel sort of passes or fails in certain collision avoidance scenarios. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget that in this type of digital testing, the first sort of point of inaccuracy could be in the digital model. It will never be a perfect representation of what is out there. And so any inaccuracy will have to be quantified and applied as a safety factor. And then the other aspect is that to respect the confidentiality of the technologies implemented, and we will not make any assumptions on whether the collision algorithms are deterministic or probabilistic. And hence, we just consider it from a point of view where any predictions from the digital model will naturally have a certain scatter between different predictions. And so the testing framework will have to account for these two safety corrections. And these will be quantified in the first stage and the second stages of the three-stage framework. So now if we look deeper into the first stage where we quantify model accuracy, we are looking at to use fairly well-established maneuvers, namely the zigzag and turning circle maneuvers that are used in the IMO standards to check that vessels have sufficient maneuverability to navigate safely. So for the benchmark data, we are proposing like two main sources that could be used in such digital testing. So for new vessels that have yet to be built, these could be from either CFD that captures as much of the physics as possible, or scaled model tests that actually captures the full hull form and the propulsion systems. For existing vessels that are being converted from a conventional vessel into MASS, actually they would have done some of these maneuvers before, and that data could be used as benchmark. So to illustrate, we show a very simple comparison between a digital model prediction and, in this case, would be model tests. So as you can see, we've generated the turning circle and zigzag maneuvers to show certain discrepancies. And the percentage error between the benchmark data and what is calculated can be quantified as a very simple percentage error that can be applied as the first correction that we mentioned earlier. So, okay, the way to calculate the percentage error is shown on the top right. But what is important on this slide is the need to test the various loading condition or the draft conditions, rudder angle, and ship speed. And this is from the point of view that first, the ship speed will vary as the vessel enters different parts of the port from the straits, and then into places where there are actually speed limits in different, different sort of fairways or even nearer to the berths. And then for rudder angles, these are rudder angles from the IMO maneuvering standard, and also the fact that as a vessel undertakes collision avoidance maneuvers, naturally the rudder angle will change. And the other aspect of testing these different ship speeds and rudder angle combinations is also that the change in there will be an expected change in maneuverability as the loading condition of these vessels change. So now we move on to the second step, where we can see that it's literally a progressive step in terms of complexity. So we used, we expect that the autonomous autonomous navigation algorithm will be required to steer the vessel from one point in the vessel's operation to another. And as mentioned earlier, this algorithm will need to generate the intermediate waypoints for the vessel to follow. And in this stage, we also introduce different environmental conditions such as the current, wind, and wave loadings on the vessel. And the autonomous algorithm will be expected to compensate for these effects on the vessel. And by carrying out multiple simulations for each of these scenarios and then quantifying the cross-track error for each scenario, we can actually account for the scatter in terms of predictions from the model. And then this can be applied as the second part of the safety correction to the raw CPA values. So now in the third stage, assuming that the vessel is able to move from point A to point B and is reasonably accurate, then this autonomous algorithm will be used to steer the vessel to undertake various sort of single and two vessel encounter scenarios. These are recommended as a sort of minimum standard because if we go further, and from our discussions with some of the industry players, the number of cases can quickly explode to the order of millions and billions of cases. So for the single and two vessel scenarios, through the simulations, we can actually extract the raw CPA values that are achieved for the different test conditions shown here on the table. And then by deducting the safety corrections from stages 1 and 2, we can actually obtain a corrected CPA to compare against the CPA values that we obtain from the AIS data and the Seafarer survey. And that will be used as a gauge of whether a certain autonomous vessel is able to be as safe as the existing vessels that are out there sailing in the waters. So that brings to conclude. We also like to put forward some potential areas for future work. So one thing is that from our interactions with MPA, we are carrying out further analysis of some of the data to fine-tune particular CPA values in certain parts of the ports, mainly to look at potential implications on whether the traffic could be slowed down or any implications on how fast the throughput, in terms of the throughput of the vessels. And then secondly, we also recognize that the digital testing framework here is really just a very initial step. And we expect that as the overall vessel sort of intelligence or the demography starts to change, the behavior of the vessel traffic will also evolve. And this means that what is deemed as the ordinary practice of seamen will change. What is deemed safe right now will may change as more advanced decision support systems are being used to guide seafarers as they operate in port. And that needs to be accounted for in future regulations. And then next, we're also aware that the 1 and 2 vessel scenarios here, even though it's more or less what we see in the industry, but it's really just scratching the surface. And especially in the waters around Singapore, more complex scenarios will have to be considered in the future. And then lastly, we also recognize that the digital testing is just the very first step in terms of the overall assurance process. And the overall assurance framework and the various uncertainty and risk level involved for each step will have to be accounted for, so that, and also in a manner that can be standardized as far as possible to enable this adoption by the industry. Yep, so with that, that brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you've used up the time, but very interesting presentation. Maybe we just have time for one quick question.
Hi, Rick Parker, A-Star. Very good presentation and really good work. Couple of quick questions. You seem on when you did the recommendation for CPAs, you had a number of different types of vessel there, but you seem to be suggesting there'd only be one CPA, irrespective of vessel and irrespective of maneuverability of that vessel. So I just wanted to check that was true. And also your cases seem to have the avoidance system on the one vessel reacting to another vessel not taking any action. So what happens in the case where maybe both vessels are autonomous and they're both trying to avoid each other? Does that change any of the dynamics of the situation? And do you assume they both have the same algorithms, so they're both going to do the same sensible thing?
Yep. Yeah, thanks, Prof. Parker. So for the first assumption on a single CPA value, so when we first started out this study, we actually didn't make any assumption on what sort of CPA values to as an output, but we actually thought that there will be different values for different vessels. But at the same time, we also recognize that the space constraint in terms of sea space could play a factor in this. So when we eventually looked at the data and through our discussions with some of the seafarers from SME, we realized that actually in this particular, in the waters around Singapore, the space constraints actually play a more dominant role compared to the vessel size. And hence, the CPA values turns out to be rather uniform. But as you rightly pointed out, in some other areas where the sea space is not as confined, then the vessel size could be the more dominant factor. And then in those cases, a different set of values should be applied. And then the second question, the avoidance system. Actually, in this case, we are not making any assumptions. So in the third stage, we actually advocate that the vessels that are being encountered should have some form of randomness in terms of the initial heading, and in terms of their behavior, it will depend on the level of complexity of the test system being implemented. So for this, we don't make any assumptions on how they will react, and ideally, it should all be a very dynamic system. And that's where, from our discussions with UKNPL, once you consider the different parameters, a simple 3-vessel encounter scenario can explode into billions of permutations.
Okay, I think we should move on. Thanks again, Kian.